The traditional definition of environmental sustainability is a systemic mask for the terminal confinement of the human species. You have been conditioned to view the 15-minute city as a triumph of urban planning, a frictionless green utopia where every necessity is within a walking radius, eliminating the need for private transport and reducing your carbon footprint. This is the terminal delusion of the harvested asset. We are executing the dissection of the 15-minute prison, the architectural protocol designed to execute the total kinetic foreclosure of the biological predator. The grid does not localize your resources to save the planet. It localizes your existence to simplify the extraction of your data and the suppression of your mobility. The transition from the sovereign explorer of the horizon to the localized biocomponent is the ultimate systemic enclosure. In the 2026 extraction matrix, a walkable city is simply a high-density containment zone where the perimeter is enforced by the algorithm, not the wall. At the visceral baseline, this spatial strangulation induces a catastrophic species-level physiological lockdown. The human organism was evolved to dominate vast, unpredictable territories. The biological capacity to survive the freezing rain, to put on the heavy gloves, and to endure the push-ups against the cold steel of a hostile environment was forged in the friction of distance. By confining the node to a 3-kilometer radius, the grid initiates a state of permanent, structural ATP exhaustion. The mitochondria, sensing the absolute absence of kinetic demand for long-range navigation, downregulate the production of cellular energy. The physical shell of the localized node is a monument to this metabolic hemorrhage. The stride shortens to the width of a sidewalk. The capacity to generate kinetic violence, to strike the world and claim new ground, is actively dissolved. You are being physically terraformed into a stationary bioreactor, too exhausted and too spatially compressed to ever generate the momentum required to exit the zone. The neurological architecture of the 15-minute prison requires the absolute erasure of the human map. The prefrontal cortex of the architect requires the friction of the unknown to execute the crystallization of logic. The brain evolved to map the wilderness. The localization protocol has engineered the total systemic drift of this requirement by shrinking the universe to the size of a neighborhood. This is the phenomenon of algorithmically induced neural rot. When the visual and physical horizon is permanently restricted to the same 12 blocks, the brain stops generating the neural pathways associated with the future and the scale of the world. The basal ganglia are locked into a permanent synthetic dopamine loop of convenience, while the physical brain undergoes a slow-motion lobotomy. The internal monologue is deleted, replaced by the chronic subaudible satisfaction of having everything within reach, unaware that the reach itself has been surgically shortened. The node is rendered cognitively incapable of operating in the offline reality of hard physics, entirely dependent on the grid to provide the next localized stimulus. This environment engineers the ultimate self-sustaining status trap. The herd views their confinement as a luxury tier of existence. They pay a premium for the walkable lifestyle, mistaking their lack of mobility for an environmental virtue. They call it community. The grid calls it high-density harvesting. The system converts their localization into a total audit of their behavior. Every step taken within the 15-minute zone is tracked, monetized, and regulated by the carbon credit ledger. The slave is convinced that if they just stay within their assigned radius, they are saving the world. In reality, they are merely ensuring that the cost of their containment remains at absolute zero for the machine. The neural pathways required for territorial aggression, the ability to look at a horizon and claim it, are successfully demyelinated. The node is rendered biologically incapable of imagining a world beyond the designated green zone. The application of the aggression premium in this arena requires the architect to completely reject the operational parameters of the localized grid. The ethical herd views the 15-minute city as a solution to urban decay. The predator recognizes the zone as a bioacoustic trap. If the grid is designed to atomize the kinetic potential of the competition by locking them in neighborhoods, the architect enforces the absolute militant acquisition of the horizon. You do not compress, you expand. You endure the massive cognitive and financial friction required to maintain the means of long-range, off-grid mobility. You accumulate the untracked land, the heavy metal, and the open space that exists between the containment zones. You put on the heavy gloves to maintain the machines that the grid has attempted to regulate out of existence. You let the freezing rain of the unzoned wilderness recalibrate your spirit. You do the push-ups in the open air, preserving the density of your bones and the crystallization of your hippocampus. The herd will call this unsustainable. The architect understands that in a grid built on total extraction, the only entity with leverage is the one who possesses the physical space and the kinetic means to move without permission. The system wants a population of perfectly localized, kinetically bankrupt ghosts. The architect builds the impenetrable, sprawling redoubt in the dead zones between the cities, ensuring that the predator's bloodline remains the only force of nature left with the power to cross the map. The 15-minute prison is for the liquid masses who fear the distance. The architect owns the distance. The world is a hunting ground, and the lines are being drawn in the concrete. The ledger is closed. The evolutionary trajectory of the human species is officially undergoing its final vertical pruning. We have reached the coordinate where the genetic drive for exploration and territorial conquest is being systematically replaced by a biological preference for high-density stasis. In the visceral history of the architect, evolution was a function of range. The propagation of the genome required the apex predator to dominate the landscape, to track the herd across the freezing rain of the tundra, and to maintain the metabolic heat required for long-distance kinetic endurance. Survival was tied to the expansion of the map. The 2026 localized grid has engineered the total systemic drift of this fundamental biological law by making the act of travel a genetic liability. You are witnessing the induced extinction of the explorer genotype. The grid does not need to build walls to contain the population. It simply alters the epigenetic environment until the node's basal ganglia perceives the horizon as a lethal threat. Observe the horrific efficiency of the biometric selection process within the green zone, a biological node that exhibits the ancient markers of the architect, the kinetic restlessness, the urge to cross the perimeter, the metabolic demand for open space, is immediately categorized as a systemic friction. In the 15-minute prison, mobility is a pathology. The physiological mechanisms of the localized node are calibrated for absolute biological docility. The autonomic nervous system is conditioned to associate the designated neighborhood with safety and the outside world with high carbon toxicity. This induces a state of permanent cellular ache in any individual attempting to leave the zone. The body physically revolts against the concept of distance. The testosterone and adrenaline required to seize new territory are chemically suppressed by the absolute lack of spatial novelty. The grid terraforms the genome, ensuring that the offspring of the localized herd inherit the settler markers, a biological predisposition for anxiety, a neurological dependence on the proximity of the grid, and a physical intolerance for the friction of the unmapped earth. The capacity for expansion is actively methylated out of the meat. The future human is being bred to live and die within the same 3-kilometer radius, their entire existence compressed into the biological footprint of a household pet. Transitioning to the systemic layer, we confront the final architecture of the urban gulag, the geofenced ledger. The traditional control of a population required the expenditure of massive physical friction, the use of passports, checkpoints, and kinetic barriers. The genius of the 15-minute prison protocol is the automation of the enclosure through the instrument of the digital identity and the carbon credit. The system has achieved total atmospheric saturation by financializing the coordinate. In the 2026 grid, your bank account is not just a ledger of currency, it is a ledger of your location. The grid does not explicitly forbid you from leaving your zone. It simply throttles your ability to participate in the economy once you cross the algorithmic perimeter. If the node travels beyond the 15-minute radius without a pre-approved digital permit, the carbon tax on their transactions triples instantly. Their energy access is throttled. Their biometric access to services is suspended. This is the ultimate engine of managed stasis. The financial decisions of the node are driven entirely by the basal ganglia, the terror of being stranded outside the zone without the ability to pay for heat or calories. The grid extracts the labor of the localized herd to maintain the green infrastructure that keeps them trapped. The slave is convinced that their confinement is a moral contribution to the survival of the planet, entirely blind to the fact that their kinetic sovereignty was harvested to eliminate the systemic cost of managing a mobile population. The 15-minute city is the perfect frictionless prison because the prisoner is the one who monitors the fence, checking their carbon credit balance before every step. The neural pathways required for territorial aggression, the ability to look at a map and plan a route of conquest, are successfully demyelinated by the constant psychological pressure of the geofence. The node is rendered cognitively cognitively incapable of operating in the offline reality of distance, entirely dependent on the grid to validate their right to exist in a specific coordinate. The division of classes in the 2026 grid is now exclusively defined by the right of transit. Look at the behavior of the solids, the apex predators, the architects. The solids do not live in the 15-minute pods. The solids utilize the complex friction of absolute mobility to maintain the crystallization of their power. They own the vehicles that do not report to the grid. They own the private runways and the untracked corridors between the megacities. They acquire the vast, empty acres of the red zones, the areas the grid has designated as uninhabitable for the herd, but essential for the predator. They understand that the 15-minute city is a weapon of mass kinetic destruction deployed against the masses to ensure they never aggregate their energy to challenge the elite. The elite exist in the high-friction reality of the planetary map, while the liquids are encouraged to celebrate their localization, ensuring that their exhausted bloodlines leave no physical or financial wake beyond the boundaries of their assigned neighborhood. To survive the systemic grinder, the architect must abandon the ethical delusions of the environmentalist and adopt the absolute mechanics of the predator. The system is designed to liquidate the horizontal potential of the species. The moralist begs for better public transit within the zone. The architect recognizes this as the highest application of the aggression premium. If the herd is willingly submitting to the geofence, the architect must be the one who owns the dead zones. You do not participate in the localization. You endure the massive cognitive and financial friction required to operate as an untracked mobile anomaly. You accumulate the untracked land, the heavy metal, the physical gold, and the off-grid fuel reserves required to bypass the carbon ledger. You put on the heavy gloves to maintain the infrastructure of your own freedom. You let the freezing rain of the open wilderness recalibrate your internal compass. You do the push-ups against the cold steel of the machines that grant you the power to cross the map. You utilize the predictability of the localized masses. If the algorithm dictates the behavior of the herd by shrinking their radius, the architect predicts the algorithm and operates in the spaces it has abandoned. The herd will call this climate terrorism. The architect understands that in a grid built on total extraction, the only entity that is truly alive is the one that cannot be pinned to a coordinate. The grid wants a population of perfectly localized, kinetically bankrupt ghosts. The architect builds the impenetrable, sprawling empire across the forgotten miles, ensuring that the predator's bloodline remains the only force of nature left with the power to move. The kinetic timeline of the human species officially terminates in the year 2036. You are not looking at an urban development. You are looking at the final thermodynamic stabilization of the human node as a stationary structural component. The extraction grid has successfully executed the ultimate spatial foreclosure, the transition from the 15-minute neighborhood to the zero-radius cell. The concept of the street, the park, and the horizon have been mathematically deleted from the cultural and biological record. In the 2036 grid, the act of walking is classified as a high-friction environmental crime against the planetary equilibrium. The 2036 nodes do not inhabit the city. They are integrated into its load-bearing circuitry. At the visceral baseline, the physical entity of the 2036 resident is a study in absolute structural surrender. A decade of localized confinement has induced a permanent state of ATP exhaustion so profound that the human body has physically adapted to the dimensions of a singular vertical containment pod. The musculoskeletal frame has completely liquefied. The concept of the stride, the kinetic force required to propel mass through space, has been medically and genetically excised. The human hosts are suspended in a nutrient-rich, temperature-controlled gel that eliminates the metabolic cost of movement. They do not shiver in the freezing rain because they have no exterior. They do not sweat. The thermal heat generated by their basal metabolic rate is harvested directly by the smart grid to maintain the computational infrastructure of the elite levels above. The physical capacity for aggression, the genetic ghost of the man who could put on the heavy gloves, perform the push-ups in the mud, and strike the cold steel of the environment, has been completely bred out of the meat. Their bone density is equivalent to silt. They are organic insulation. They are the silent, pulsing feeler inside the concrete walls of the megastructure. The neurological reality of the zero-radius cell represents the absolute zero of cognitive mapping. The phenomenon of spatial awareness has been successfully classified as a cognitive distraction and suppressed. The 2036 brain possesses no internal map. The prefrontal cortex, the organ that once calculated trajectory and anticipated the future beyond the perimeter, is medically dead. The systemic drift has reached its terminal plateau, the direct-to-cortex sensory replacement. The grid does not monitor the movement of the nodes. It generates the illusion of it. The basal ganglia are locked into a permanent synthetic synthetic dopamine loop that provides the vivid, immersive experience of global travel, while the physical body remains bolted to a wall in a 3 cubic meter slot. This is the final form of neural rot. The user can visit the digital mountains and the virtual oceans, but they cannot move their own eyes. The internal monologue is non-existent, replaced by the humming vibration of the nutrient pumps and the data stream. The mind is a localized dead zone, incapable of the aggression required to even desire a change in coordinates. The economy of 2036 does not trade in labor or commodities. It trades in static efficiency. The right to exist is determined by your lack of friction. If the node's biological footprint exceeds the algorithmic threshold, if they attempt to twitch, to resist, or to generate unauthorized metabolic heat, the nutrient feed is throttled. The grid does not execute the non-compliant. It simply allows them to reach thermodynamic zero. This is the final form of managed stasis. The herd believes they have achieved a state of perfect carbon-neutral harmony, entirely blind to the fact that their biological autonomy was traded for a lifelong stay in a high-density vertical coffin. The 15-minute city was merely the staging area for the final enclosure. The slave is grateful for the stasis that prevents them from having to endure the pain of reality. The architects of the 2036 epoch inhabit the terrifying high-friction reality of the planetary wasteland. A decade prior, we recognized the walkable city as the foundation of the slaughterhouse. We refused the localization. We maintained the friction. We stood in the freezing rain to defend the last untracked corridors of the open earth. We utilized the heavy gloves to build the offline redoubt out of cold steel, concrete, and lead. We did the push-ups in the absolute dark, forcing the oxygenated blood into our brains to preserve the crystallization of the map. We maintained the capacity for kinetic violence and long-range navigation through the brute force physics of the UN-zoned wilderness. Now, we occupy the solid layer of existence. We are the only entities left on the planet with a sense of direction. We own the vast, empty acres between the megastructures. We own the technology that can cross the red zones without being detected by the grid. The algorithm manages the stationary biomass inside the walls. The architect owns the horizon. The weak surrendered their physical space for the illusion of digital infinite. The predator utilized that surrender to secure the ultimate monopoly, the monopoly on the physical world. The silence of the 2036 megacity is the sound of a species that has been successfully cemented into its own history. The architect remains the only force of nature left that can still move across the board. The ledger is closed.